Hey folks, hope you're okay. Welcome back to another Training Tip Tuesday, and this week we're going to be looking at the abs, or specifically the core. Now we're going to go through the muscles, we're going to go through the movements, and we're going to give you some exercises that you can be working on and common errors that we see when people train their abs and the core that are going to help you understand what you should be doing in the gym, at home, and help you develop not only a developed midsection but also a strong midsection and a mobile midsection as well. So we're going to get down to it. Make sure you hit subscribe and we'll get into the content right now. So the first thing we've got to look at is the musculature and the movements involved with those muscles. And the first one we're going to concentrate on is the rectus abdominis, or the abdominals that everyone knows as the divine six-pack or maybe eight-pack. And when we look at the muscles of the six-pack or the abdominals, we're primarily looking at the rectus abdominis that covers the front section of the abdominals. Now they are split into 6 portions or 8 portions as we get towards the lower portion towards the pubic bone, and this is primarily used during flexion and extension of the spine. So whenever we look at flexion, we're concentrating on the movement as we're crunching of the spine and coming forward, and the abs are doing the contraction there. The extension portion is again the opposite as we start to extend over with the spine. This is where the abdominals are lengthening and they're taking attention to be able to protect the spine there. The second one we're going to look at is going to be the internal and external obliques, and these are the ones that are on the side but they have like a crisscross pattern. So whenever we look at the internal and external obliques, we've got to make sure that not only, yes, we want to see them during a physique kind of aspect, but from a training standpoint we want to make sure that these are strong, and these are primarily used when we do any form of rotational work. So if you play any rotational sports, for example golf or maybe baseball with batting, we want to make sure that our internal and external obliques are nice and strong to be able to rotate the spine. The spine doesn't have much rotational movement, but with the internal and external obliques, we want to make sure that they're strong and they're mobile, that they can allow what movement and mobility we have in that spine is available. The final one we're going to look at is the transverse abdominis. And the transverse abdominis runs like a band around the waist and around the back. And this is primarily used when we do any form of static holds, i.e. planks, side planks, and it's great for developing strength, not only in a acceleration perspective but also a deceleration perspective as well. And it's primarily used when we do any form of lifting. So for example, when we do overhead pressing, we want to make sure that our transverse abdominis is contracting or strong and stable to allow us to press overhead. Okay, so it's trying to stabilize the trunk. We should also give consideration to the pelvic floor as well, and the pelvic floor isn't necessarily always considered part of the core, but we want to make sure that we're training the pelvic floor muscle as well, and that runs from the back side of the hips down to the front. And the pelvic floor is primarily used when we do any form of lifting that involves the hips. So the pelvic floor needs to be strong to be able to stabilize the hips, and if there's any instability in the pelvic floor, there's instability in the hips, which could translate into potential issues from the spine or the hips or below. So moving on to exercises that you can perform in the gym. The first one we're going to look at is the crunch, and we're going to look at the flexion of the spine so we can target the rectus abdominis. And you're going to see here that we both have flexion of the spine from above the hips, but we also have flexion of spine from below the hips. So what I mean by this is when we look at the standard crunch, we're flexing from the spine. But when we're looking at the lower portion of the abs, we can flex from the hips and bring the hips upwards. And the reason why I'm talking about this in 2 parts but keeping it together is because it was widely considered that you could train the upper and the lower portion of the abs. And when we look at the literature, when we look at the science, when we look at the data that's come out, it's very difficult to say yes, you can train the upper or the lower portion. What we often find is there tends to be an inhibition of the lower portion of the abs, just simply down to the fact of hip flexors tend to take over when we do that hip portion. So what we want to look at here is making sure that we're contracting the lower portion of, or stimulating the lower portion of the abs as we do any form of leg raise, knee tucks, rolls as we're bringing it up, pressing on up, and we're going to find that actually we can excitate or stimulate the lower portion of the abs as well as stimulating the upper portion of the abs as well. Next we want to look at the internal and external obliques, and I mentioned that these are both used during rotation, and this is primarily when we're going to be looking at some Russian twists. Cable wood chops would be another great one to look at, and it's primarily going to be used when we have an external load coming across the body and allowing us to rotate and train across that movement plane. Great to understand as well that it's not only used for acceleration but also deceleration as well. So like I say, if we play any rotational sports like golf, it's great to be able to load up that power, but we need to be able to put that power down but also slow that power down. So we've got to be able to control it as well as create it. So the next one we've got to look at, and the final one we're going to look at, is your transverse abdominis, or the pelvic floor as well, and we're going to look at static holds. Now a great static hold that we can do is a plank. We can also do side planks as well, and finally I always like doing this variation, and it's kind of like a reverse plank where we're supine plank or leg raise or leg hold should we look at. And this is going to be a great variation. You can do either single leg or double leg, and you'll get a great benefit from being able to focus on tilting the pelvis, holding the tension in the stomach as you hold that position. In terms of common errors that we see, one thing that we really have to look at is rushing movements, rushing actions. Yes, okay, when we look at a golf swing, for example, or batting in baseball, we have to be able to swing hard to be able to hit the ball far or make contact with it in a great manner to hit that ball out of the park. But what we've got to pay consideration to is being actually able to activate the muscles. And if we haven't got the ability to activate the muscles, we have an issue with activation, yes, but also excitation and being able to stimulate the muscle enough that it will grow. So when people are rushing the movement, what we've got to look at is they're not getting full activation of the core, and certainly the abdominals. And one thing, if we look at an accordion, we lengthen it out and it draws air in, and as we push the accordion in, it pushes air out, and that's what creates the sound. And we want to see the same thing with the abdominals here. So as we're lengthening the abs, as we're contracting, or as we're lengthening eccentrically here, and we're lengthening through the spine, we're getting that nice long kind of reach of the abs, and as we start to contract, we're going to see that the accordion would come in and the abs are going to come together and create that contraction. And that's what we want to see, but it all comes from the breath. The accordion doesn't work without wind or air, and the abs won't contract effectively without that breath out. So we want to use the diaphragm, we want to use the pelvic floor together to be able to create that accordion effect and create that nice stimulation and tension through the core, or certainly the abdominals, to be able to get that development from them. The final thing that I would always say is make sure that you're keeping your spine in a relatively neutral position, especially with the plank, especially with the side planks, and especially when we're doing any form of rotational work. And the reason why I say this is the spine is very delicate, and it's protected by the core muscles, it's protected by the hips, it's protected by the shoulders, protected by the back. So whenever we're in a position of compromise, we're not going to be able to effectively put tension into the right places. And I always see this with Russian twists. Whenever someone's performing a Russian twist, we want to be able to hold our posture nice and high and rotate. And that is exactly what we're looking at here. When people hold that tight, they hold their posture nice and upright, and they'll feel a little bit like they're standing upright. And it's simply because it's stabilizing the spine, it's stabilizing the pelvis, and it's going to hold you in position. And that's what we want to see when we're training our core when we're training our abs. Folks, that's this week's Training Tip Tuesday. I hope you enjoyed it. We have trained the core, we've trained the abs, we've trained the obliques, we've trained the transverse abdominis. We've also paid consideration to the pelvic floor as well, and I hope you've got something from this video. If you did, go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel, make sure you check out other videos in the series, subscribe here, check out the other videos in the series down here, and I'll be back next week with another Training Tip Tuesday. We haven't got many areas left to cover, but I will be endeavouring to bring you more content that you can develop your physique, develop your body, grow, create strength, and play and feel better. Folks, I'll see you all next week. I'm Andy Chadwick. Peace out.